Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, to the University of New York, Medgar Evers College. Today is Tuesday, March 12th, 2024, and our 5 minutes of grace period has just elapsed, and we are now going to start today's lecture. As you may recall, 2 weeks ago, we began a three-part study of the three theoretical perspectives of global trade. To reiterate, the three major perspectives include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and historical materialism. And our discussion last week centered on realistic perspective. As we discussed in the previous weeks, the main common feature of the group of critical perspectives is that they are all critical of traditional, mainstream, liberal, and realist perspectives. While we will touch on several critical perspectives, and as I'm sure some of your assessment for the week may point you to, we will devote more attention to historical materialism, or the Marxist, than to the other critical perspectives, especially because historical materialism encompasses the largest group of critical theories, including Marxism, dependency theory, world systems theory, and the Gramscian analysis. Although these approaches have some roots in Marxism, they often diverge substantially from classical Marxist thoughts. Historical materialism is historical because it examines structural change in terms of class and sometimes north-south struggle over time. And it is materialist because it examines the role of material, especially economic factors, in shaping society. Recall that in previous weeks, I said that I had mentioned that one of the defining cleavages in the international order is a north-south divide, otherwise known as the global north or the global south. The global north, again, is most of Western Europe, North America, if you were to look at the map, the Northern Hemisphere. And then there is the global south, Africa, South America, Southwest Asia, South Asia, and the rest. Generally speaking, the global north is more prosperous than the global south. And this can sometimes shape, especially as historical materialists would frame it, it can sometimes shape the international political economy. So let's quickly go over some of the learning outcomes that you have for this week, right? Well, we expect that at the end of this module, that you are going to be able to do the following. The first is explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade. Right, that's the first learning outcome. So, a Marxian school of thought on global trade relation perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profit through exploitation of surplus labor. The Marxian school of thought considers global trade relations as an inherently unequal exchange. Marxian narrative fits into the phenomenon of global trade between developed and underdeveloped country, i.e., which often tracks, not so much i.e., but which often tracks the North and South divide, as I just explained, as well as exchange of production between underdeveloped societies. More broadly, Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not the clash of interest and power, but rather a reflection of the global mode of production and ensuring relation of production among nations. So the second learning outcome is to describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of the Neo-Gramscian theory. Provide examples of dependency theory of global trade relations. So here is how I will begin to unpack that second assessment. The Neo-Gramscian approach does not consider the realist school of thought and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive, but rather it considers the very theoretical foundation of the two schools of thought as mutually reinforcing within a lock-in relationship between agency and structure. In Neo-Gramscian approach, a class or nation state cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest, and neither can it dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. One of the ways you can think of this, and there are two classic examples of these alliances. One is an economic alliance, and the second is a military alliance. So consider the European Union, which is an economic alliance, or consider NATO, which is a military alliance. Examples of dependency theory of global trade relations include, and I say this in quotes, China Belt and Road Initiative. And if the class wants to deep dive this after the formal lecture, I'll be glad to do that as well. So the BRI, as the China Belt and Road Initiative is often abbreviated, has been accused by many institutions in the West as creating a debt trap and therefore dependency. Of course, some in this class have argued that the IMF is a Western institution that creates dependency as well. And that is a good counter argument. I should say, though, that the idea of debt trap diplomacy, that lots of research out there also debunks that as the intent of the Chinese. But rather, some research may appear to suggest that that is an outcome of endogenous challenges in the political economy of global South countries that precludes them to have an economic arrangement that functions optimally so they can fully utilize the value of those Chinese-funded projects. If you were to unpack that argument a little bit more, you would find that those endogenous factors are not very dissimilar to those that inform regulatory reform by the IMF on donor countries. There is, and oftentimes the IMF finds that there are imbalances in these economies and that the lack of fiscal buffers is a major contributor to why these countries are unable to withstand shocks to their economy, and that having a more efficient bureaucracy, a leaner bureaucracy, and being able to build up fiscal buffers are necessities for the economies to stabilize and indeed begin to grow. And the absence of some of these fundamentals may also inform the inability of Chinese funded projects through the BRL to underperform. Another example of the dependency theory is the active extraction of resources from less industrialized poor periphery countries for the benefit of the highly industrialized, wealthy, poor countries. In this way, the world is polarized into two: the patron, highly industrialized, wealthy poor nations, and the dependent, less industrialized, poor peripheral nations. The theory would argue that periphery countries are poor because they are forcefully integrated into the international division of labor, where they principally function as suppliers of raw materials or repositories for cheap labor. This resource diversion is typically maintained through active collaborations of local elites of poor countries and the dominant states who share common interests. So this is really an interesting perspective, right? So this perspective considers that the whole point of global engagement is that countries in the periphery, the global south for the most part, are the intent in engaging them is that they become a supplier of cheap labor and they become a source for resource extraction. It'll be hard to prove intent, but what is clear and evident is benefits. Clearly, as I've described in previous classes, there is a comparative advantage and trying to relocate low value, low wage, often low wage sectors to developing countries. But it's also true that countries that begin as repository of cheap labor can quickly move up the value chain. And China is one such example. South Korea is another such example. And in many ways, and increasingly Vietnam as just a few examples. So I don't know that this is a rigid structure or more the outcome of challenges within the political economy, endogenous political economy of countries in the global south. But again, that would be a vibrant conversation to have, which is the greater determinant of this unequal relationship. The third is argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That, again, it goes back to the broader argument that I was looking to make. Yes, it is true that resource extraction is often the focus of the global North engagement with the global South. But here's what's interesting, though. The United States, as just one example, is also the world's largest crude oil and gas producer, or at least top two. But yet, we don't get to think of the United States as being exploited for its natural resources, and that's because the size of the U.S. economy is large, diversified, and highly skilled. So the challenge then is, I would argue, is there an endogenous theory of growth and development that the global South has that it would like to advance in the international order? And how coherent is the implementation strategy, and how united is the global South in advancing this strategy and agenda? These are all some of the stronger points that, again, I'll be glad for us to tease out at the end of this lecture, of our formal lecture period. The other is to also recognize that there are some efforts, but again, it is the coherence within this effort. One significant effort by the global South will be the BRICS countries. BRICS, interestingly, was coined by a Western financial analyst, and the term BRICS. And up till now, it is not clear what BRICS really represent. Is it an alternative to the G7? Potentially, it could be that will highlight the interest and advance the agenda and interest of the global South countries. The problem, though, is that unlike the G7, who are strategic partners and allies, many countries in the BRICS are strategic competitors. And many of them have actually military conflicts. One clear example is China and India. And there are sources of tension beyond that border, Tibet as one example. And while China and India are founding partners of the BRICS alliance, India tries to foster a strategic partnership with the United States, while China fancies itself as an emerging hegemon. Then comes the issue of Russia, that is now seen increasingly as a rogue actor in the global stage. And with a myriad of sanctions, trade relationships between Russia and even India, its BRICS partner, tends to be exploitative to the extent that the Indians don't mind buying energy resource from Russia as long as it is at a discounted rate. Increasingly, there are challenges on how to settle those bills, or how to settle those transactions, or what currency to settle them in. But that's a whole broader, a deeper conversation that will take us on a different tangent. The point that I make, though, is that there does not appear to be a strategic partnership between member states of BRICS. Indeed, Saudi Arabia, the newly invited member of the BRICS alliance, is eager to sign a strategic defense alliance with the United States as part of the broader Abraham Accord, which will normalize relationship between the Gulf states and the state of Israel. So, unlike the G7, where there is shared values and shared strategic alignment, it is not obvious that the BRICS, as an example of a global South institution, has that kind of coherence. If you were to delve deeper into sub-regional organizations, you could look at what's going on today in Haiti, the unrest in Haiti, and the regional body of the Caribbean called CARICOM. They are relying on the United States to help shape and frame and advance what would appear on the surface to be a Caribbean agenda to restore order in Haiti. So, in a sense, it is hard to see how CARICOM could be a counterweight or an advocacy group for the global South, which in sometimes will be in conflict with the interests of the global North, when on some of the biggest issues that confronts the organization, it seeks the partnership of the United States, the hegemon in the global North. So if you were to look at Africa and you were to look at, say, the ECOWAS region in West Africa, where there does not, that what has now emerged as the Coup Belt in sub-Saharan Africa does appear to have made an informed calculation that the benefits of being in the economic community of West African states isn't just worth it, and there isn't much to lose if they get kicked out. So much so that the committee, ECOWAS, kicked out Niger, Republic of Niger, and is now trying to welcome it back into the fold. I think the East African community, I believe it is considering bringing back Gabon as just another example. So the strength of these institutions, the norms, having shared norms and shared values and having a strategic agenda has never really been firmed up. And that's, I think, in part why they are not as effective in the global stage. But again, those are some of the challenges, right? So, so congratulations upon your successful completion of week 7, module 7. You should now be able to, by the time you turn in your assignments on Friday, You should now be able to explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade relations. We've gone over that. Describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of the neo-Gramscian theory. We've gone over that. Provide examples of dependency theory of global trade relations. We've also gone over that. Argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Well, we've also gone over that. So with our studies over the past 3 weeks, by the end of this office hour, you should be able to identify at least three critical ideological perspectives of global trade and political economy. We've gone through each one every week, and this is the third week. You should be able to explain the philosophical differences between the critical perspectives and the liberal and realistic perspectives. You should be able to describe the differences between the various critical perspectives. And for next week, our focus will be on the international monetary relations. And that will bring in our good friends at the IMF. So this is the formal sector of this week's lecture. I will now turn off the recording so that we may get to the informal Q&A. Thank you.